Welcome to the Currency of Grief, the podcast where we confront two of society's most taboo topics, death and money. My name is Justin Weidenfeld, and I'm here to serve as your grief financial officer, guiding you through the complex and emotional journey of what happens when money and mortality collide. Whether you're navigating the aftermath of losing a loved one, looking for practical advice on handling pre- and post-death planning, or simply just wanting to start those hard conversations about legacy while you still can, this space is for you. Together, we'll hear real-life stories from real-life people who have navigated the intersection of grief and money and come out the other side. Our guests will share their stories, practical insights, valuable advice, and moments of clarity so that none of you have to navigate this alone. I'm grateful you've decided to join us on this journey. Now let's dive in. So without further ado, let's meet our guests for today's podcast. Josh Aronoff began his career in Big Law after receiving his JD and MBA from Duke University. Go Blue Devils. After losing his father, Josh found himself navigating the overwhelming and costly and disjointed process of administering his father's estate. The experience exposed serious flaws in how estate planning and administration are handled, leading him to co-found Herbie, named after his father, a platform designed to solve for others the problems that Josh faced in his own journey. Josh's cousin was kind enough to introduce us. He's a fraternity brother of mine, and he said Josh was doing some cool stuff. So upon that introduction, we immediately hit it off and bonded over our shared experience, and he was kind enough to join us on the podcast today. So Josh, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Justin. I'm happy to talk about my experience and hopefully it maps well onto your mission. I think it does. And obviously, we share a lot of the same goals, both personally and professionally.
Yeah, and I'm excited to dive into all of that. So, um, alongside your story and how it correlates to our mission here on the Currency of Grief, what made you want to come on to the podcast today? Besides me
So
asking you, of course. Of course.
it wasn't that you're a Florida fan, so I appreciate you saying go Blue Devils anyway.
We're not.
But the reason I was excited to come on, I think, was to hopefully shed light on my experience, which was unknown to me at the time. So if we, um, with some shared experiences, have dealt with certain things that other people haven't yet dealt with, but as you mentioned, absolutely will, and can save people an awful lot of time, money, and ultimately stress and anxiety. That's a very worthwhile goal in my view.
Yeah, definitely. And it sounds like you're on that path with Herbie, which I'm excited to dive into as well today.
Yeah.
Sweet. So here on the Currency of Grief, as our listeners know, we don't stall. We dive right into the deep stuff, the hard stuff. And so, Josh, tell us about your grief story.
So my dad, whose name was Herbert or Herb usually, Herbie to his friends and family, was always a planner. And he not only enjoyed, but I think did a great job of managing his family's personal finances for the most part. He had an estate plan, which had been updated infrequently, which I'll come back to. Um, but he always did a great job of keeping tabs on all those types of affairs, making sure he was organized. As someone who had never smoked in his entire life, he unfortunately was diagnosed with small cell lung cancer in 2016. He was pretty good for several years. But then towards the end of 2019 and then in the beginning of 2020, quite bad timing with COVID, actually, um, he started to decline. And, obviously in our case, there were no surprises in the trajectory of his illness and ultimately his passing. But, I guess I'll stop with the overview and see what you want to focus on. But we learned plenty of lessons after he passed away that we wish we had known or appreciated before he had passed away when it came to managing his affairs. Um, the parts without being too eager to dive into the finances and the estate planning, kind of necessary chores aspects. No one tells you, at least not me, and I assume my experience is representative. No one really tells you what it's like beforehand. You hear of people passing away from cancer all the time, but until you see it, you don't really know what it means. And so that, again, at least for us, influenced a lot of the uncertainty that we felt during his final months, weeks, and days.
Hmm. Um, Thank you for sharing that, um, sharing your story. And you mentioned we. So who's we? Tell us about the characters and the family dynamics. And how old were you in 2016 when you got he received his diagnosis?
Yep. So I am one of two children. My sister is 3 years younger. In 2016, I was 26.
Wow.
My dad was a dentist. My mom was a nurse by training and worked in his office for many years. I was living in New York, so they were in Atlanta where I grew up. My sister was also not in Atlanta. I don't want to confuse the years and have her accuse me of being wrong. So it was either in college in New Orleans or living in Los Angeles at that point. So neither of us were home. Um, it was super unexpected. So my dad he was very active around the house. He had been working on floors, I think, and had shoulder pain that wasn't going away
Hmm.
and several doctor's appointments. Finally, it's one of these things you assume it's going to go away. It's probably just an ache, maybe a
Yeah.
muscle soreness. Several doctor's appointments later, MRI is what ultimately led to the diagnosis. And, who knows as a function of timing, but at that point it was stage 4. I think small cell lung cancer, particularly, is very prone to metastasizing, and it had spread into I think 2 of his vertebrae.
Yeah. So you being in New York, your sister more likely than not being in Los Angeles. Um, what is it like as a 26-year-old to receive that like to hear that about your dad?
Yeah, so I maybe it's being an older sibling, maybe it's just my personality. I'm very practical, and maybe pragmatic is a better word.
Hmm.
Um, I my probably also a bit as a defense or protection mechanism. I immediately went into like, okay, how do we fix it mode? And at the time, he felt fine. So even when you're in the midst of receiving a diagnosis like that, it doesn't really um, it affects you in that you understand the import,
Yeah.
but your tomorrow's no different physically, right? Like it was an eventuality that in his case was several years later. But it's one thing for him to sit there and, explain to me on FaceTime, what this means and what had been told to him. And of course, he was still learning at that point. But it's another thing to actually appreciate what it means several years later. Um, but so my first move was, okay, like, what is it? Chemo? Are there other treatments? In the case of his particular cancer, he was able to take immunotherapy drugs, which worked very well. They have certainly unfortunate side effects, but he actually never received chemotherapy,
Wow.
which was a great thing for his quality of life.
Yeah. And you mentioned as you dove into your grief story, the feeling of uncertainty. Where did that feeling come from? Was that around the diagnosis and how long he was going to live? Was that um, your new normal and what was the future going to look like? Your role as the older brother and the oldest child?
Yeah. So all of the above is the real answer. Um, I remember at one point, uh, the anything financial or kind of very practical was out of sight, out of mind. And when we went back, so my sister and I, my wife, went back to Atlanta, and it was in March 2020. So we went and quarantined for 2 weeks outside of Atlanta. Um, Finally, we went back, and he was starting to be pretty obviously uncomfortable at that point. And I remember calling a friend, one of my roommates from college, who was not an oncologist, but as the doctor friend fields a lot of these calls, I knew he was the one to call. And I was kind of like, what does it mean? Like, what is actually going to happen? And he explained that, and it's helpful. I'm happy to go further in that. But I made the same call to to my dad's oncologist, and um, doctors tend to be very formulaic, not only in their practice, which as they should be as professionals, but even in those conversations. And so the order was that actually reversed. I called his oncologist and was able to ingest what he told me and explained to me, and then I called my friend and said, "What does this actually mean?"
Hmm. Yeah.
And even the voiceover, until you're with someone, especially someone you care about that much, and you're seeing the decline in their physical you know state, you never know what the next day is going to bring. And that was like the uncertainty of not knowing what the next day was going to bring to someone. And it's not just, it wasn't just my dad. There are ways to make him comfortable, which we of course did. It's
Hmm.
almost harder to watch your other family members experience the grief that comes from watching him. And my role, if you will, as kind of the big brother was, um, at least what I felt was to kind of be the rock and make sure that the practical things were being taken care of, so that other people could have their own space to grieve as they wanted.
Yeah. Did you ever have a conversation about that role, or was that just like, all right, I'm the older brother, I'm the oldest son, I'm the man, like, let me be the emotional rock?
We never talked about it, and fortunately, I don't say that as a hero. I do think that it's also my coping mechanism. I think that I you know, my wife would have plenty of thoughts on this topic, but it's never been my style to be outwardly emotive. And it's not that I don't feel it, certainly, but between the coping mechanism of wanting to latch on to, like, okay, what do we do next logistically, both for myself and so that others, like, for example, I know my mom, right? I will never have the understanding of what it means to be a mom and see your kids be that upset, but I didn't want to add to that feeling for her. And I'm sure it's the same, mom, dad, whatever. I'm sure it's the same, but I certainly didn't want to add to the sense of distress or grief that she obviously was experiencing otherwise.
Yeah, I'm sure no parent wants to see their kids experience any type of pain, yet alone the pain of loss.
Yeah. And, I don't know if this is a shared feeling or not, but, um, he was my dad, and I was obviously, as we had an amazing relationship, I guess is not to be assumed, but we did. And he was one of the closest people to me, period. But for my mom, they had spent a lifetime together. I had spent 30 years with him, and we obviously there were aspects of our relationship that were unique to us. No one else shared, but my parents had been together for much longer than that. And therefore, again, kind of logic kicking in, but therefore, I kind of assumed, and I think it's fair, that her grief level, or at least her all of the above, right? Grief, uncertainty as to what's next, because I was living in New York, I was off on my own, but they were still together day in, day out. And then all of a sudden that changes. And what does that mean for your routine? What is it? Again, you're still holding aside all the lofty, like, estate planning and administration and personal finance conversations, which were completely foreign to her. Um, but there's a very basic, like, it hurt most for her. And therefore my sister and I needed to be there for her.
Hmm. Definitely. So, how before we dive into how you supported her and the family, who, this is your time to shout people out. So who supported you? Who did you go to for support from an emotional side, and who supported you?
So we are very lucky to have um, a very strong support group from both family and friends, specifically in Atlanta. Um, the timing was really bad because this was June 2020, and a lot of our family, I should have been more specific, family was not in Atlanta. Some were in Florida, some were in New York in general. But I'm very lucky to have all of my really closest friends from not only high school and college, just the way it played out in Atlanta. Um, and I remember, sitting on the driveway, 6 feet apart, um, with a bunch of my friends, in the days leading up to it, everyone was very quick to bring food. And, I remember thinking, like, I need people to stop bringing food, but it's not, no one cares about the food. It's like, I'm going to bring food so that I can come spend time with you. And, that was invaluable, especially at that point. But I remember, you know, having big group Zooms after he had passed away and just spending time with other people, both family and friends, was really invaluable.
Wow. So it sounds like the role that COVID played was, as people came over and paid their respects, like it was on the driveway 6 feet apart. It may have been a little bit more challenging to see him. You probably had to quarantine, it sounds like, for 2 weeks outside of Atlanta before going in to see him, because he was more likely than not immunocompromised. And then afterwards, I mean, traveling was sort of out the window for other family members, and so you kind of sat over Zoom virtually and gave each other like virtual hugs um, during that during that time.
Yeah. Yeah, it was about as bad of timing as it gets. And obviously COVID impacted everyone. We were fairly lucky otherwise, in terms of where I was in life, where we were. We were, we our wedding was supposed to be later in 2020, originally planned for Labor Day 2020. And uh, I cannot complain about the COVID experience in terms of the stress that it caused us, other than, this was in the very beginning and no one knew. Therefore, we were all, you know, taking it extremely seriously because the risk was unknown.
Yeah.
I remember being at the funeral and thinking, like, I don't care. I'm going to hug this person who came to my dad's funeral, and obviously they don't care either. But it was still like a whole thought, right? And
Mhm.
it was definitely a bummer. But there's also, even amidst that level of uncertainty at the beginning, there was some perspective on, the value of a hug, even given the possibility of someone having COVID, was important.
Yeah. Um, During the years that your father was undergoing his diagnosis, and then or his cancer treatment, and then immediately after, how did your life and routine change living in New York? Like, how many times did you go to Atlanta? Did you change in the way you called or communicated to your parents and your sister? How did that all work?
Yeah, definitely. I would imagine that anyone answering that question would say less than I wished I had. Um, Hindsight, I think that's an inevitable feeling, but there was definitely an emphasis on the value of time, right? Like before that, it was probably going home for a weekend with no plans. And after that, it was like, let's spend the weekend at the lake or at the beach, or, um, I grew up riding a dirt bike, and he got a four-wheeler just to be able to follow me around. And, there was a lot of that, and the things that like were most valuable to us uniquely, and how we spent time. So definitely that. I was um, working at my first job at a big law firm in New York. And in case people aren't familiar with what that means, it means working all the time. And obviously people are understanding as humans, and I was lucky to be at a great firm that was supportive. Um, but it was not I also could not just say, I need to go and spend an immeasurable amount of time with my family. So, and obviously my parents were supportive of that as well. So we made it work, but it wasn't necessarily easy given the distance and the the demands of my professional life at that point.
Hmm. Would you change the work experience at all?
No, I don't think he would have wanted me to.
Understood.
And again, this is all of these topics are so inherently personal that I should probably just stop saying, for me. But um, it, I, again, being super honest, I think it was a bit of a coping mechanism. It's always like, what should I distract myself with, or what should I focus on instead of um, the sadness of something that's beyond my control. And I think my dad specifically was really good with that idea as well. Like his condition, his fate, was beyond his control. And I remember there were times where me being the type A, one of the three of us, especially, I was like, I think you should be doing more to try and deal with this. And specifically, obviously, he was taking the immunotherapy drugs that were prescribed to him, but it's like there's a clinical trial at Mayo Clinic that might be a good fit. And even that's a fine line. And this might be hard to articulate, but when, you're at the point of like considering clinical trials, you're also telling yourself it's like 90 seconds left in a football game, right? Like you're telling yourself it's probably the I don't know the statistics, but like you have to start throwing Hail Marys in order to have any chance, right? And that's not a good headspace to be in necessarily. And so to to prolong that headspace for as long as possible, there's like a trade-off there. And so I was definitely the one that was, I remember being online with my sister when we were quarantining on our way back home in March and like looking up lists of clinical trials. And my parents were kind of like, it's for one reason or another, we're just not going to do it. And us kind of being frustrated, but also respecting, it's ultimately his call.
Yeah. As we segue into the finances, my analogy, besides like the 90 seconds in the football game, which also resonates with me and Dan Marino over here. Um, but the analogy was like the Bitcoin conversation that we were talking about. It's either going to go to a million or to zero. um,
Totally.
but I digress. So, when did finances come into the picture? When did money come into the picture?
Yeah. So it was one of these things that was always on my mind. Like I remember it's funny how you track certain memories that are not that meaningful at the time, but I remember being in a Chick-fil-A drive-through and probably 20 sometime in 2019 and him saying, I've been trying to teach your mom how to handle all of the finances. And in their case, what that meant was pre-internet. He was 75, I think, when he passed away. So pre-internet, throughout most of his adult life, he had bought different assets. And those assets, perhaps they had, I'm probably going to butcher the names, but perhaps they had been bought in 1985, a mutual fund from
Insert
Scott
company
Trade.
there.
Yeah, insert company that existed then, but not now.
Yeah.
Either because it was bought by a more, recent online platform, or it went out of business, whatever. And so he wound up with, I don't remember the exact number, but a lot more than I have. No, I'm not talking about like value, but the number of accounts and the number of funds specifically on paper that was impossible to deal with if you hadn't been dealing with it your whole life. If you
Hmm.
hadn't been adding one at a time to add, like, I'll just say 20, I don't know, but to take 20 accounts that you weren't inherently familiar with was a nearly impossible choice. So I remember him saying, I've been trying to teach your mom about some of this stuff. And I remember thinking, like, it's not, I doubt she's going to really be able to pick it up. I hopefully you can get it organized. But, even fast forwarding through March of the following year when it was bad, it was always on my mind, but it was never like, now's a great time to deal with this. Like, let's
Mm.
take the afternoon and instead of going to the lake, let's deal with it.
Mm. And by deal with it, it's not like solve all the problems, but let's have a conversation about, hey, this account is at this company, and this account is at this company, and this one's paying the water bill, and this paying is paying the electric bill, and this is your college fund, and this is and and it's really challenging because it's I mean, even back then, people would call them up and say, hey, do you want to buy this? This is the idea. Like and they would say yes, and they, all right, send me $10,000, and then you have $10,000 over here, and they'd send you paper mail, and you may not ever see that. You don't really interact with anybody. It's just like an account here, and then like talk me through what it's like to organize all of that.
Yeah. So you're right. It's not, there's no like financial decisions that I'm talking about, right? Like it wasn't how are we going to optimize, our tax planning strategies. It was like, what's the password for the Fidelity IRA? Like how who's the beneficiary? Like I assume it's mom, but like, is it?
Yeah,
And like literally, how are we going to access and deal with these things? What's step one? And, it's something that's super easy to talk about in hindsight, but at the time there was never like the right time.
yeah. What was the most unique or surprising thing about this experience? And
Um, so the complexity of the basics,
that's
which
an
is a simple
oxymoron.
a simple statement, oxymoron, but I do think it's kind of the problem with this whole thing. And even for someone like me, who is by no means sharpest guy on planet Earth, but I had studied some of these topics in school, and I generally like to manage my own finances, and I consider myself relatively self-aware on these topics. But as soon as it comes time to deal with these things, so someone passes away, you assume while they're still around, everything is handled and good because it's theirs, not yours. And then they pass away, and you give yourself a period of time. And obviously that depends on every person and their family, but you give yourself a period of time, and then it's time to deal with it. And there's a mountain of things to do. Some of these tasks actually kick in right away. So, how do you obtain a death certificate? Why do you need a death certificate? Who's going to ask you for it? How many copies should you get? Et cetera, et cetera. My parents had been proactive in, burial arrangements and plots at a cemetery, et cetera. And all of this, side note, I should say, is in the context of a very foreseeable passing, right? Like all of these things, we shouldn't discount what happens when someone passes away due to an unfortunate accident. And none of these things had the opportunity to be thought of. But, getting more into the substantive, like, the assets that my dad had that need to be distributed according to his estate plan. And in our case, um, it was about as straightforward as it gets, right? He was the first spouse to pass away. It was his only spouse. He had two kids. Fortunately, there were no um, disagreements or disputes over his assets. It wasn't like my sister was going to argue that the assets shouldn't be inherited by my mom. Um, so we were lucky in that regard. But the problems start to come in two ways. One is running up against substantive topics that you're just not familiar with. So, for example, probate. I should, be embarrassed to admit or question whether I knew what probate was before this, right? Like, I'm sure I had heard it. I'm sure it was on the bar, but I didn't understand it. I definitely didn't understand
Yeah. Do you want to
it.
shout out your estates and trusts professor at
And
law school?
it's a good question. It was an elective in law school. So like,
That's
it's not,
that's sad. That's like
yeah,
I'm angry right now
it's a
because
very, yep,
yeah, we're all going to experience it. So if you're going to pay the extra money to go to law school, like you might as well take a class that's going to then like at least teach you something that's going to be applicable to everyday life.
totally. It's a really good point because like we could spend the next hour talking about the things in law school that you do have to take that are not really necessary. But anyway, the second kind of major obstacle that you start to face is just the amount of things there are to deal with, and it depends again on each family's circumstances. But in our case, it wasn't necessarily the value, right? Like it's not the gross value of the assets, but it was the dispersion and the number of accounts, the uncertainty of what is where and the unknown unknowns, literally. Like you start to think of that framework. You have known unknowns and you have unknown unknowns. And in this case, when you consider the fact that everything is taxable and there are serious financial implications to every decision that gets made, um, it starts to be very intimidating.
Yeah. Okay. We went through a lot there, but that was super helpful. And I love the framework of the unknown unknowns because that's the uncertain that's what leads to uncertainty after grief and the scary part.
Right.
Um you mentioned the period of time that you may have taken before action. And so what was that period of time? And when did you dive into action? And were the people around you ready to dive into action as well?
So it was about a month for us. And, different, I guess different timelines apply to different burial arrangements, etc. But there was a significant amount of time of just not wanting to deal with it. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's okay and it's healthy. Obviously, the death certificate um, happens pretty quickly, typically through the funeral home, at least in our case. And then there's a period of time where it's, everything's okay. You're just kind of getting stabilized. Um, and for us, it was about a month later, dedicating time to sit down and start making a spreadsheet.
Yeah. Did you go back to work or were you like kind of home in Atlanta for the month?
I did both. So I did stay in Atlanta for a while. I did go back to work.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't remember exactly how long I took off.
Yeah.
Probably a
Did
week or so.
did your big law firm like give you an adamant bereavement leave, or was it like, hey, 3 days, come back to the office?
No, it wasn't. I think it was a week. I don't want to be wrong about that, but um, and I think it's funny. It's one thing to go on a vacation with your friends and
Yeah,
decide you're not working. In this case, it was obviously much more of an obligation. Um, and so, I think there's a mutual, probably across most companies, regardless of space. I'd like to think there's a mutual respect for that.
yeah. Um, so after that month, or when you finally took out the spreadsheet, what were the first financial or logistical steps that you had to take and post getting the death certificate?
Yeah. Um, so I was starting from the very beginning, and I think these are topics that a lot of people are a little bit afraid to admit how unfamiliar they are. Um, because the reality is daily life does not require interaction with these things, even though they're by definition universal. So, I was actively investing my own money in various brokerage accounts, whatever. That doesn't mean that I actually understood the importance of who or what owns an asset, a financial account. whether it's owned by Josh Aronoff or the Joshua Solomon Aronoff Revocable Trust, or by Josh Aronoff and Josh's wife. Who are the beneficiaries? Do IRAs have beneficiaries? Do brokerage accounts have beneficiaries? Can an IRA be owned by a trust? And these are when you have one of each of these different types of accounts, which I think most people generally have a grasp of what an IRA is versus a 401k, but do you really? Right? And like, because you're not asked, no one asks, everyone talks about it and everyone has one. And so when it comes time to actually deal with it, you got to know. And this was pre-ChatGPT. So there was a bunch of Googling. And when you Google something like, that's a bad example. Uh, what does it mean if a trust is the beneficiary of a brokerage account? You get a response, and this is still true of ChatGPT. You get a response that has 6 words that you don't know. You ask what one of those words means. That definition has 6 more, and there's this exponential, percolation of words that you don't know what it means, and you're already looking down the barrel of a very vast, body of unknowns, and it's very intimidating.
Mm. Yeah, it is intimidating because it's like, this may be about bad analogy, but it's like all of a sudden someone dies and you're in heightened emotion and grief, and then they're like, all right, your entire world is now in Spanish or French.
Right. For
Like
sure.
you're like translating everything.
Yeah. Well, I
And
think it's a good analogy. It's, and the problem is it matters, right? Like, it's not like a video game where it's okay if you fall into a cliff. Like, these things matter, and you know that.
so your role that you took on, were you actually the executor of your dad's estate, or how did that go? And who else was around you to go to for questions? And like, how do they charge?
Yeah. So in hindsight, I'm convinced there's 2 ways people deal with this. In general, obviously, speaking in general terms. Either you pay a lot of money to professionals for them to oversee the administration of the estate. And I'm sure within the ranks of professionals that do this, there are great, capable, proactive people, and there are those that aren't. But in any event, it's going to be extremely expensive. I was not the executor. My mom was. Um, but given my background and legal, training, I guess I was in at least as good of a position as she was to be able to read the documents and start to figure out what actually needed to happen. But there were still, obviously things that I didn't understand and thought it would be valuable to speak to people that do this every day. So there's 2, you know, types of professionals that I thought would make sense to call. And one was a lawyer and trust and estates lawyer, and one was a CPA. And those people typically bill by the hour, and um, they're very expensive. And so I remember those first phone calls, holding aside whether they were helpful or not. Um, the nature of it again is there's just the a first call like that, you have to start to cut through the unknown unknowns. You don't know the questions to ask. And without having this person, without having a family office or a professional accountant or lawyer who literally focuses on your affairs, it's a very inefficient circumstance. And even though that person wants to help, they can ask you questions. You may or may not understand them. You may or may not know how to answer them. You may or may not know how to find the answer. And it's just a very inefficient scenario.
Yeah. Did you talk to your family's CPA or attorney before he passed away?
No. And yeah, no.
It's like meeting someone for the first time and understanding, like, it's like us, if we recorded this podcast like the first time we met, we would have no idea how each of us communicate. And so that's even
Yeah.
challenging as well from communication styles. But your dad's estate plan, basically, was it like a pour over will, everything um that was either like, was anything in trust beforehand, or did everything go into the trust with for your mom's benefit?
Yeah. So the good news, as I mentioned, was that it was a relatively straightforward scenario, at least as far as the family dynamics. And, in general, there are really three parts of an estate plan, right? There's the assets, the people, the beneficiaries, and the wishes, um, or how they get distributed. So in our case, the assets were practically very complicated because of the reasons I mentioned earlier. They were scattered, and a lot of them were prehistoric. Um, the people were very straightforward, and the wishes or the distribution plan was very straightforward. The complication was in the lack of understanding that my parents, it became pretty evident that my parents had, and I certainly didn't know before figuring it all out. But they had, I think fairly typically, they had created their first estate plan in 1994, right after my sister was born. And they had wills and revocable trusts and, the ancillary documents as well. But just to focus on those two, those are kind of like, in case it's helpful for background, those are kind of the two operative documents of most estate plans, right? And the will says, a pour over will says everything gets handled by the trust, and the trust says how you want to handle it. The executor is the person who oversees the will, and the trustee is the person who oversees the trust. Um, in our case, the complexity was that some of the assets were owned by the 1994 trust. In 2019, mid diagnosis, they redid their estate plan for the first time in 15 years. A lot had changed in those 15 years.
That, well, 1994 to 28
19,
29. So what?
2019.
Yeah, yeah,
And yeah, sorry, 25 years.
yeah. I was gonna say
Um,
a little bit more. Add a
yeah,
decade.
thanks. Um, so when in 2020, when it was time to figure out who owned what owned what assets, the answer was both. And so we had, a combination of four total owners and joint five, I guess. There were either jointly owned assets, there were assets owned by each of them individually, and there were assets owned by each of their trusts from both 1994 and 2019.
Wow. So how did that complicate things?
So it was a question of, when you boil it down, it's a question of practically what needs to happen for each asset, right? So, um, Vanguard, a Vanguard brokerage account that is owned by a trust. In order to transfer the ownership of that asset, the brokerage account, to the beneficiary, and I'm using beneficiary as not that's maybe again a bad example, but not the beneficiary designated on the account, but assume there was no beneficiary. You look to the trust because it was owned by the trust, right? What do they need in order to process that? They need certain documents that are different than if it had been owned individually with a named beneficiary. And we're kind of like fairly deep into the weeds. It's helpful. I'm happy to go further, but
No. Yeah. So they need documents. They have every institution has their own forms that you need and process that you need to fill out. They have a department that I'm convinced just like is at the bottom of some like like room with no windows that like is miserable, just handling all these death claims. And these forms that, I'm gonna say this in jest, but like your parents' estate plan wasn't up, probably weren't updated in 25 years. or my dad didn't even have an estate plan, so like maybe they're whatever. The big institutions have forms that like maybe are updated, um, but I'm sure those antiquated, like understanding what's needed from 20 different institutions, um, how
How do
it's
you find? Yeah.
yeah, how do you the unknown unknowns, um,
The
you know,
phone number to figure this out
yeah,
because it's not really evident on their website. It's not, when you go to vanguard.com, it doesn't say click here to learn how to inherit an asset.
right. So, um, yeah, it's a lot. So, how long did this whole kind of a kind of organization accumulation, who owns what, what's the beneficiary spreadsheet, take you to build out?
So the spreadsheet itself, getting our arms around everything, or at least eliminating most of the unknowns, was several weeks. The actual administration was several years. And that's a result of, life, and there was no practical need to get a lot of these things done, but the practical inhibitor was when you find the phone number. And I don't want to pick on certain companies, but some are worse than others. And you have an annuity at X annuity company, and you call that phone number, like you said, it's an unknown, like musty basement somewhere where someone decides maybe they want to pick up the phone after 2.5 hours of waiting. And in a world where no one's hanging out for 2.5 hours, it's, well, to make that call, it just doesn't work well. And so, at risk of cutting to the chase, the biggest, what I started to realize was it's not even the legal documents. Like, they're in our case, they become very interesting if there are disputes or there's interesting situations where you need to refer to those persons, wishes in that case. For us, it was like this would have been so much easier if there had been a named beneficiary, because then it's one piece of paper and it's quick. And the legal documents were great, but it was this like the estate plan itself is like what makes this easiest for your family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, so you would say you like brokerage accounts in trusts or having a TOD or POD beneficiary on them, and then IRA transferring an IRA to a beneficiary IRA. Yes, you have to open a new account, but it's a lot easier if you have a named beneficiary on there.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, the model that I wish we had um, was either with a financial advisor or someone who had a view on these things. Not necessarily a lawyer because they focus on the documents rather than the complete picture, but someone who had a view to the practical aspects. And, then it comes time to implement the practical aspects. And it's much easier. And like the unknowns are not, they're not as intimidating if someone has a view. And while every individual family has the same problem, the problems are common across families typically, right? So, therein lies the problem, is it's very hard to appreciate the severity of these problems until you deal with it. And so having someone with a view across the estate, and the state is a term that like most people don't even truly grasp, but like it's just the assets and affairs, what happens with someone's things when they are gone, would be invaluable.
Quick plug, that's what I do in my other business. I'm a grief financial officer role here at the Currency of Grief. Anyway, um, okay. So it sounds like just having a view into everything, it's just every aspect of someone's financial life, who owns what, where is it, what's the account number, ahead of time throughout your life as you're accumulating, because you and I, we're in accumulation phase. If we create our estate documents today, and 25 years from now, we're going to have accumulated 25 years worth of more stuff, whether it's the pictures behind me or accounts at different institutions. So staying on top of that is very important.
Right. And it's much easier. I'm sure there's, a sage expression that covers what I'm about to say, but it's so much easier to iterate on these things. If you do it when it needs to be done and it's a little change rather than 25 years of big changes, it doesn't happen that way. People don't do it. And if you try and do it, you forget things. You overlook the beneficiary on that one account.
Mm.
And it's just inevitable.
Was there anything that, like, was there anything that was like a oh crap moment? Like, why didn't this change? Like, maybe it was the wrong beneficiary, or like a trust being the beneficiary where it should have been something, or something like that.
There were a couple where we thought they were big oh craps. I think in our case we managed to navigate through them. Um, could have been really bad, especially in a lot of cases where there are competing interests, which is a euphemism for disputes or people who are angry at each other or clamoring over someone's assets. Um, it would have been years and hundreds of thousands of dollars maybe of litigation. Lawyer fees tend to add up that way when people are angry. But one example, which um, was gotcha, was cost basis. So the cost basis of an asset, a home, for example, gets stepped up when someone passes away, or if it's jointly owned, then 50% of it, half of it gets stepped up. And that just among life and everything else going on, that was completely overlooked. And it occurred to me, years after the property was sold that we hadn't done that. And, so fortunately you can go back and amend a tax return, but, at the same time, it was dumb. It was
Yeah.
just an oversight, but it was just a lot of value.
Yeah. So, and the same thing, so similar thing happened to one of my dad's home, which was we had to go back 9 months later and get a as of August 2018 appraisal, and say, all right, he bought it for X, it's now worth Y. And so if we sell it for Z, we're only paying taxes on that instead of that.
Right. And, for most, imagine just to use my dad as an example, right? Like he was a dentist, and people do accumulate this type of knowledge over time, but like when it's not something you do, it, you either don't know it or it gets lost. And that's because of the like array, like you said, of assets that we accumulate over time, and they're all different in little ways. And so I guess the point that I'm trying to make is you know people have this concept of an estate plan as being an expensive and fancy legal scheme. That is a small portion of what I view to be an estate plan. The call it 25%. The 75% is a very practical, like, how do I make this easy on my family? And by easy, I mean stress free and cheap. There's no reason that a family should deal with the anxiety of the unknown unknowns and the expense of having to pay someone else to figure all this stuff out, especially when those two are exacerbated by the grief that people are feeling at the time.
Yeah. Um, Twofold. One, I have conversations with a lot of people about this topic, and their number one thing is, I just don't want to be a burden on my family. And the practicality and the logistical stuff is really what weighs people down. It's not, damn, I wish I got an extra $100,000 from my mom or dad. Additionally, I have a family member who passed away, and helping another family member navigate this situation. and we just got quoted a bill from an estate attorney for over $60,000 to navigate a family their spouse's estate.
Yeah,
It's a lot of
it's
money.
wild. It is. Regardless, of what portion, I think people tend to think about these things and as a percentage of the estate, but objectively, regardless, it's a lot of money. And um, you said being a burden on your family. It's a very interesting thing because, like, regardless of whether you have, $1,000, 100,000, $100 million, like it's literally the most important things in your life. Like you worked your whole life, regardless of how many years that is. But like, think of all of the sweat, right? Like when you were sweating over the SATs, right? Like it was a means to the end of the value you created throughout your life. And that value was a means to an end to, obviously enjoy things in life, but also to provide for your family. And the fact that literally everyone almost, the vast majority of people, um, tend to, um, deprioritize or not prioritize enough the most important things in life that are subject to an inevitable, future, and that we all pass away. It's a really interesting thing.
Yeah, it's your legacy and taking the SATs and getting into the school that you wanted to get into, getting into Duke, getting into the University of Florida, um, getting into the University of Michigan, where my brother's going. Like that's part of your legacy, and then this is also stuff that you leave behind as part of your legacy as well.
Right. And, it's interesting to hear, the focus. You have a obviously great and unique perspective on that. Like the fact that people are focused on that um, means they appreciate it enough to do it. And, but the reality is like 2/3 of the adult population doesn't have a will. They don't have an estate plan at all. And, the statistics are just that people aren't ready, and it unfortunately becomes very challenging for their families as a result.
And by not having these conversations or planning, then not only is it logistically difficult, but it also becomes more cost effective. And so I think that's a really good transition into like, when did everything shift in your personal and professional life after? How did it shift? And then what is the one resource that you wish you had at the time? And sounds like you're working on now.
Yeah. So for me, all of the timing of actually administering my dad's estate um, happened to happen at the same time as being in a place in life where I could focus on solving a problem that I thought was in desperate need of solving. And we've done that together with my founding team. We've done that on a platform called Herbie. And, obviously the name is meaningful to me, but the goal of helping everyone with minimal effort and minimal cost be able to avoid the type of stress, anxiety, um, and cost that we dealt with is what we've built. And we're excited to start to introduce Herbie to people across the country. We've recently become available in 9 states, and we'll be rolling out the rest of states very quickly.
That's awesome. So the idea, the mission behind Herbie is there. It's helping people navigate, create, be proactive in their planning, make sure that they're not a burden to their family because they have a plan and hopefully are able to view everything and everything that you experience and I experience. Logistically, what is Herbie? It's a software, it's a website, it's an app. Talk me through that.
Yeah. So Herbie is a software platform. Anyone can make a will completely for free. If you want to take advantage of premium features like being able to share your plan with your family or create a trust, um, being able to update it over time by keeping all your documents current, organize your beneficiaries, et cetera, et cetera. We have a subscription. And the idea behind Herbie is to make it truly accessible so that anyone, regardless of your background, level of education, number of assets, et cetera, can handle this.
Mm.
And by extracting the complexity and the cost, there's no reason that 2/3 of the population should not have a will. Everyone, literally everyone, should have a will. And we're not going to solve for everyone's complexity. There's plenty of complexity in personal circumstances, families. Um, but really, until you're starting to think about estate taxes and how to structure around them, which, by the way, just got increased to $30 million between a couple.
Most
Uh,
Americans are not at that level.
at the federal level, at least, I should say, at the federal level.
Yeah.
Even though a lot of people think they have some unique scenarios, it turns out we're pretty similar. This gets back to what I mentioned. The problems across families are felt 100% by each family, but they're pretty similar. And most people tend to want their assets, to flow to their spouse and then their kids.
Mm.
Um, but the knowledge gap between us and the very small number of great estate planning attorneys has just been so big that it's been forever, 2000 years, whatever. It's been a very expensive and very complex product. And, I certainly think we've figured out how to make it easy and quick and accessible for everyone.
It's amazing. That's awesome. So we know I mean, I hear the passion in your voice and I feel it for myself as well of why Herbie is so important, being able to give people access to a will and an estate plan. And it sounds like who Herbie is for is people like you and me who need to get documents done and need to want to remove as many barriers as possible to doing that, not sitting in a stuffy attorney's office, but more like being able to do it in the comfort of your own home with your family or the people who need to know around you, and just and going through like a really efficient process. Is that
Right.
accurate? And if you're over the federal estate exemption limit, you can give me a call. Happy to go on your boat sometime. But um, it sounds like those people should be hiring those legal professionals.
Yeah, for sure. And there are plenty of resources that exist today, both other online platforms and documents that you can go and read. The difference that I think is between the people today that do have the third of people that have a will but likely don't update them and the 2/3 that don't is there's a very large group of people who know they should have a will but haven't because it was too complicated or expensive. So if you make it super easy and quick, you can do this on a flight. You can do it while your kid's at soccer practice. You've been meaning to do it. And if it's easy enough, you'll just do it. And by the way, that's true for the updates over time, right? Like if you want to keep your assets organized as you go, it's much easier to do it each time you buy a major asset. You buy a house, you sell a house. If you move, I just moved from California to Georgia, I would have to completely redo my estate plan because these are state law documents. It's way easier to do that if you just change your state, on your Herbie profile from California to Georgia.
Yeah. Are you available in both California and Georgia?
Not yet.
Okay.
California is a community property state. We're starting in common law states, which I think there's 42 common law.
Yeah,
Georgia will be at the end of the month, end of July.
that's awesome. Talk us through, as a business nerd myself, talk us through the evolution of when you thought up Herbie, how you partnered with your co-founder to now the launch.
Yep. So my co-founder, whose name is Michael, and I went to law school together, and he he happened to be practicing trust and estates law at an amazing law firm in New York. And so when I decided that I wanted to focus and invest my time in building Herbie as both a product platform and a company, he was the first call. And his ability to, obviously be an expert in the legal aspects of this, which have to be 100% correct every time.
Hmm.
And, for now, my vision, I think that there should be a day, and if it's not today, we have resources available. You can call someone on our team and talk to, an expert at Herbie, but, there should be a day where, the same way that everyone banks themselves, you know, aside from having someone like a valuable financial advisor who can have a view across the portfolio and help make decisions. I go on my bank account every day, or my brokerage account. People do this all day, every day now. There's no reason that your estate plan should not also be done by you all day, every day. Not all day, every day, but very frequently.
Yeah. Sounds like a
And
morbid day, just thinking about when I'm dying.
right.
Yeah.
So when I called Michael and kind of said this, I half expected him to tell me I was nuts. But his response was quite different. He was like, I've had the same vision and
Mm,
let's do it.
it's
And
amazing.
so that was last fall. We've since built the platform. It gets vetted by lawyers in every state, hence rolling out, across states. So that we know that any estate plan, any document produced on our platform is 100% legally valid. And it's not just valid, right? Like valid is a basic box that gets checked. There's a huge range between valid and good or great,
Yeah.
you know? And so we always joke. I mean, we are constantly, it's our job literally to be on top of these forms, and they change over time. And we will make sure that, um, our users have the best estate plan they can get.
Yeah. And I know you're on top of it because I read your newsletter or Michael's newsletter about the new bill, and it was incredibly digestible, incredibly accessible. And I took some stuff out of it and created a LinkedIn post. And you guys are on top of the laws and how they're changing so that you can provide this service to as many people as possible who need it.
Totally. And, we're a team of three plus several part-time. And
Yeah.
as we roll out across states, we're really excited to grow. And
Yeah.
um, there's so much, literally everyone, given that everyone needs one of these things, we're excited to bring it to as many of them as possible.
Yeah. Um, that's awesome. Once you create an estate plan, call it on Herbie, or elsewhere, how would you recommend like bringing it up with your family if that's appropriate?
Yeah,
Because
I'm
you
glad
could
you brought that.
create it online and then it just stays there and nobody has the login or the password to get it. Um,
Right.
so talk me through that.
I'm glad you brought that up again, because you said it at the beginning as one of your goals, with the podcast. And it's really another interesting topic because people, for, somewhat obvious, but less so when you stop and think about it, people tend to, historically at least, be uncomfortable talking about these things, either because, one, they don't like thinking about dying. Obviously, we can all understand that. Or two, they don't, I think, and this is, I haven't experienced either of these myself, but I think that people are uncomfortable by the idea of having their children or other beneficiaries be aware of either, the types or quantum, the amount of assets, because money has a way of tending to make people act differently, right? And so there's a concern there. There's a couple layers. There's a way we solve it, which I'll come back to in a second, but there's a couple ways to handle it that I think solve the problem. One is kind of a big, lofty, soft societal norm where I think it's the way it's become more acceptable socially. People have become much more comfortable talking about a lot of topics that used to be uncomfortable. I think this falls into that category. Everyone wants to talk about dying, but no one does. And I think we're kind of getting to a place where people are more open generally. Two is you can share, you know, you can share the structure of your estate without sharing the amounts. And we let people do that if your estate plan is organized on a platform, you can add your executor, you can add your family members so that they know what to expect and how to handle it. Because it's one thing to have everything in a drawer somewhere, and like something unfortunate happens to me and my wife knows where the things are in the drawer, but that's not helpful, right? Like, you have to convey the knowledge to the person before you're gone by definition. Otherwise it's you can't.
Yeah.
And so the transfer of that conversation is important to have beforehand, but you don't have to tell everyone everything there is to know.
Hmm. Yeah. I think the amounts, it's not about the amount, it's about the intention. It's about, I bought this because of this. I bought this house over here because it's my kid's retirement plan. I bought this account over here because my friend helped me invest in it. Whatever it is and where it is, and getting organized, um, and not being a burden to the people that you leave behind is incredibly important.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. Again, was focused on kind of the practical aspects of how to deal with the things. But when you think about it from a personal perspective, and every asset, especially the meaningful ones that someone accumulates over their lifetime, it's probably less about the thing, right? Like,
Hmm.
I drive my dad's truck and I love it. It is not because it's my favorite color or because it's 20 years old, it's because it was his. And
Mm,
for him, if there was a way for him to convey to me what it meant to him, or what it would mean to him for me to be driving his truck today,
yeah.
that's valuable.
Hmm. What kind of car is it? What truck is it?
It's a 2007 F-150.
That's sweet. Is
Yeah.
it also called Herbie? Because when I first heard Herbie fully loaded.
Totally.
I
That
love
is, you get that a lot, but no, I don't actually call it Herbie. Maybe I will.
it. Well, I just love, one of the questions that I typically ask is, how are you honoring your person? And by working on Herbie, it's in the name, but also the action of helping everyday people make and making estate planning accessible to them is, it's impactful. It's going to change the world. And if you can increase that 66%, or I guess decrease it, make it go the other way, allow more people to have a plan that is changing people's lives.
For sure. And, obviously, personally, I'm very excited about the idea of building an amazing product and an amazing company. But at the same time, the thought of helping people avoid some of the problems that exist today, like there's plenty of days where there are, you know, issues, or it's still work, right? Like, we're still working, even though everyone, I think, kind of pictures startups as being fun and kind of the Wild West, but it's still work. And it makes it a lot easier to um, remember what the mission is when it's something you truly believe about. And, honoring my dad, uh, is just a cherry on top.
It's amazing. Um, as we wrap up here, I want you to imagine that someone's listening, they're 26 years old, and then they're about to embark on the same thing that you embarked on over the last many years with your father's diagnosis and his passing, all the logistics and the financial stuff, and up to today. What advice would you give them? What would be your, as we call it here, a grief mantra?
Yeah. So there's an expression I love, because it applies across a lot of things, but it's, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And the sooner you start, the sooner you finish. And there's a couple aspects of that, but in this case, it's so much easier to do these things a little bit at a time. And not only do you sleep better at night, the term legacy is often used as before very recently, I didn't appreciate what that word means. It means all the things we've talked about for the last hour, but you sleep better at night knowing that you don't have to worry about your legacy. You don't have to worry about what happens to the things that are most important to you, being your family and your assets, if something happens to you.
Mm-hmm.
And there's the secondary feeling of I'm on top of it. Like I have accomplished this and it's easy to update and it's easy to keep. It's not this intimidating thing on my to-do list that's very expensive and time consuming.
Yeah, I love that. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. That's awesome.
And the sooner you start, the sooner you finish.
Yup, I forgot that second part.
The first part is more important.
Yeah. Josh, this has been incredible. Thank you so much for your time, valuable insights, and sharing your story on the currency of grief.
Yeah, thanks again for having me. I hope it's helpful. And I'm always happy to chat through this stuff either personally or through Herbie.
That sounds good. I'll link Herbie to the show notes, and I'll link your contact information to the show notes as well through Herbie.
Perfect.
Amazing. Podcast family, thank you again for tuning in to another episode of The Currency of Grief. We'll see you in 2 Fridays from now. And just remember, it's a great day to have a great day, so go have a great day. We'll see you soon.